boy.
Gary, a warm SaberCat welcome, I would appreciate it. Thank you. Gary Stager. Thanks all of you for being here. I don't know how you do it every morning. I can't get up at 6 a.m. Although Jim never told me that I was actually doing this until I arrived here in Colorado the other night. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, and then I have, I don't know, about 36 hours worth of content that we can squeeze into an hour. I'm going to try to mix it up a little bit and not just talk at you, show some video and have you have a little bit of discussion and things like that. And then we'll have ample time for questions. You can play Stump the Chump. So I've been working in education for the last 34 years, trying to help teachers make sense of the wondrous opportunities that computational technology and the emerging materials with which we can make stuff and as a result construct knowledge have become available to us. I've taught everything from preschool to the doctoral level. I was involved in working with the first 2 schools in the world where every kid had a laptop, which was almost 26 years ago. It just kind of makes my head explode when I think about arguing over whether kids should have access to computers. You know, call me a cockeyed optimist or utopian. I also think that maybe someday in my lifetime I'll see a moment where we no longer argue about whether kids should have access to calculators. Yeah, I know, maybe all the batteries run out and the solar ones can't be charged because the sun is blocked for an indefinite period of time. But guess what? The sun is blocked for an indefinite period of time. You've got more pressing concerns than your math worksheet. You probably should worry about the apocalypse. I created one of the first online master's degree programs for teachers. My own doctoral research was based on creating an alternative, high-tech, multi-age, technology-rich learning environment inside of prison for teenagers, where I work with kids from 13 to 21. And I currently work in a quasi-administrative teacher mentoring role at a pre-K through 8 school in Los Angeles. Traveled about 180,000 miles last year, and when I'm not on the road, a third or half the time, I'm actually working in a school with teachers and kids. So, I want to start off with some principles, some of the things that I believe, some of the provocations that I think we should consider as we go forward as educators. Jim was talking about continuous improvement. Seymour Saracen talked about schools having the capacity for self-correction. I used to have a crazy old trumpet teacher who used to say, never satisfied, only gratified, which is kind of another interesting way of looking at the same idea. So, the first idea is a Piagetian one, and this is kind of fundamental, and that's that knowledge is a consequence of experience. That learning is personally and socially constructed based on some experience. We're going to talk about this a lot. The second idea is that we have a sacred obligation to introduce children to things that they don't yet know they love. That's why they come to school. There's a difference between connecting what kids love to something that might be new or foreign or unpleasant to them and pandering to them. The things that bring me the most joy and power and purpose and peace in my life are things that I learned in public, middle, and high school. And sometimes I get introduced as being fairly radical, but my anger is rooted in a refusal to deny another generation of kids of the kinds of rich experiences that I had at school, despite the fact that most of my high school experience was fairly torturous. But there were pockets of the day where my life was changed and where the skills and the appreciations I developed, the habits of mind, serve me every day. Another big idea, young people have a remarkable capacity for intensity. Young people have a remarkable capacity for intensity, and it's incumbent upon us to build upon that capacity for intensity Otherwise, it manifests itself as boredom or ennui or misbehavior, or perhaps just worst of all, wasted potential. You know, one of the things you can do, you know, spend some time in someone else's class, or just sit in the back of the room, try it for a whole day and see if you don't want to bite your arm off. There tends to be kind of a malaise in schools, even the best schools. And we can turn the energy level up a little bit. I use the analogy in the school where I work that we need to just gently increase the temperature on the hot plate that the frog is resting on. And one of the teachers said, hey, yeah, nice metaphor for children, Stager. I said, I wasn't talking about the kids. You know, I was working here at the school yesterday, and you know, you could talk to Michael or Ryan or some of their colleagues about, there were kids who were absolutely on fire who aren't typically in that spirit. Just based on talking to them or suggesting an interesting project they could work on. And this is also about knowing the kids and knowing what they're capable of and knowing what they're interested in. There was a kid who I'm sure isn't academically successful and probably has lots of challenges, who had a bag full of completely brand new electronics that barely anyone else has, that could be used in really powerful ways to learn new things, to serve the school, to invent, to create. And it didn't take long for me to figure that out, but I wonder how long the kid's been schlepping this stuff around in his backpack. So this is a photograph I took in one of the early laptop schools. The kids were programming in what was called Logo Writer at the time, kind of a predecessor to Microworlds or Scratch, which were more modern programming languages. And in the time that elapsed between hitting the return key and awaiting the result to appear on the screen, you can see the kid in the center of the picture. He's literally shaking with anticipation. Every ounce of his being is mobilized in anticipation of the result. And in that moment, and in hundreds, literally hundreds of cases since, teacher took me aside, whispered in my ear, and said, and that kid's not very good at school. And that doesn't come as much of a surprise to me, because there's an acute intensity imbalance between his sense of self and what he's capable of, and the pace, and the content, and the tone of what happens in school. You know, if you give kids an hour to answer 3 questions on a worksheet, half of them will take the entire hour, and half of them won't finish. But if there's a classroom where there's a variety of activities to engage in, even if you think that worksheet's important, some kids will finish it in 2 minutes and then go do something else. So I really think we need to take seriously this notion of intensity. We also should believe that kids are competent. Again, there were kids I was working with yesterday who know Linux inside and out. They're teaching themselves, you know, network technology. And there were other kids who know poetry and other things. And we ought to take what they bring to us and view it as a gift that we can use to leverage, to channel, to take them in directions further than they could have gone on their own. Now this is a really big idea that I find remarkable that it's controversial. I got hired by one of 2 private schools in West Virginia. That's right, West Virginia has 2 private schools. Remember, one in the north and one in the south. And I got hired by this school right before Christmas. They wanted me to talk to their math and science department. It was a high school, about the direction in which they were heading. And I quickly got the vibe of the school, because on every surface of the building was a poster that said something like this, or written on the whiteboard. It would have instructions like, read your math book, take careful notes, read your notes, copy your notes, copy the math book, study for the quiz, review the quiz, take the test. And then it would say history, and it would have, you know, copy your notes. It would have all the same stuff in every. And part of my responsibility, remarkably, was to try to convince high school science teachers that there ought to be science in science class. That the notion that science was active, that it's something you do, that it's experimental, that you get your hands dirty, that you have to stand up and move around and work with materials and talk, was kind of an alien concept to these, you know, quite well-established science teachers. There is a growing body of evidence that says if you start with the experience, kids will learn better than the alternative. My colleague Paolo Blickstein at Stanford conducted a number of studies that concluded that if kids have an experience before the lecture, reading the chapter, watching a movie, they'll learn better than if it was the other way around. So there's no substitute for experience. And I'd like you to consider that things need not be as they seem. Whether you believe that we need to change what happens in school or not, you ought to just play some mind games with yourself. Like, what if we didn't have quizzes and tests? Or, what if there were no discipline problems? Could that be possible? Well, in 3 years working inside the prison for teenagers, where we worked 5 hours a day uninterrupted on personal meaningful projects, and we were freed of all curriculum and assessment requirements by the state, because the governor recognized that doing the same thing louder wasn't going to achieve a different result. We didn't have a single kid who had to leave the classroom for discipline reasons. Not once in 3 years. These were supposed to be the most dangerous, violent kids in society. We had kids who were self-mutilating, but never happened once in our classroom. We often didn't even know about it until another kid told us, oh yeah, he's a cutter, but I look out for him in here. Think about summer camp, there's no discipline. There's all kinds of contexts where you can have kids together productively, where you don't have to worry about, policing. And the same is true for how we teach and what we teach. I often give the advice that if you're lecturing for 40 minutes, try 20. If you're lecturing for 20, try 10. One of the great gifts I got working with these severely at-risk kids was they wouldn't tolerate more than a minute or two of instruction. And it turns out, you never need more than a minute or two of instruction. Show them something, explain something, ask them to do something. Then you can bring them back together, but keep things moving. So think about, if you had if you were king of the world, what would your classroom be like? What would your school be like? I can tell you, you work for an extraordinary leader who's taken some serious risks in a political climate that you wouldn't expect that would be the first inclination. So, I operate under a couple of assumptions. One is that the kids want to be here. And so if you operate under the assumption that kids want to be here, it changes the culture and the climate of the classroom. I want to live in a world where kids wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and can't wait to get back to school to work on some project that they're involved in. And I want to live in a world where teachers wake up every morning and ask themselves, how do I make this the best 7 hours of a kid's life? How can this be fun for all of us? How can this be rewarding and challenging for all of us? Because it's equally exhausting to be a lousy teacher than to be a good one. It may be more exhausting. That if you have to come home every day hating yourself and hating your job and hating your kids. And sometimes you just have to really focus on what's the goal here. What is it that I'm trying to learn? How do I lower the level of antagonism between the adults and the kids? What would happen, for God's sakes, if occasionally you said to a kid, okay, don't do it? In my experience, every time I've ever said to a kid, whether it's an elementary school kid or a doctoral student, you got some B for the assignment, don't do it. And walked away. They either chase after you to do it, or you've solved some problem that you didn't want to have otherwise. I'll give you a couple of examples. I had a project idea once in a graduate class. 80% of the students got working on it immediately. They were really excited. The other 20% started bitching. And it became really clear to me that the 20% was going to kill the experience for the 80%. Because one of the truths in education is, when we talk about balance, we forget that the weeds will always kill the flowers. That if we have some good ideas, but we just kind of let some of the bad ones stick around for a while, the bad ones always win. In education, bad ideas are timeless. It's the good ones that are incredibly fragile. But I had another experience where doctoral students had to write a paper for me. And I got these papers and I read them and I was suicidal. They were just awful. And I thought to myself, okay, Stager, what's the point of this assignment? Because I could have done a traditional. I could have gotten out the red pen and I could have written F, whereas one of my friend's 15-year-old daughters got the first week of school this year. F, underline, exclamation point, circle around it, just for emphasis from the caring professional she was entrusted. So what would that have accomplished? So when I thought about it, I thought to myself, well, the goal of this is for them to learn to write better. How can I help them write better? I turned tracking on in Word, and I rewrote all of their papers. And then I handed it back to them. And the first question I got was, do you want us to resubmit these? And I said, I didn't want to read them in the first place. But if the goal was for you to become a better writer, I made your writing better. If you're concerned about this, you know what to do. It's kind of self-evident. We don't have to engage in this like, the kabuki theater of, I mark it up, you do it again, I mark it up, you do it again. Because the most scarce resource in school is time. And these trade-offs we make all the time that sacrifice time that kids can be using to test the larger hypothesis, embellish, decorate, iterate, make a better version of something, get lost if we're constantly bogged down in chatting about what we're doing or some mechanics that don't make any particular sense. So I want to lead into a little bit of video and have a bit of an activity with you. I haven't done this with a group in a while. This is Frank Gehry, largely considered the world's best contemporary architect. He built all these wild buildings out of materials and shapes that would have been impossible without the presence of computers. Despite the fact that he's in his 80s, he's completely comfortable with this technology to make these wondrous works of art that people work and live and play in. And there's a series on HBO occasionally. Now, to say that it's on HBO is a slight exaggeration. It's on HBO at like 4:13 in the morning. Called Masterclass. It's produced by an organization called Young Arts. And Masterclass is a very simple idea. Young people who are gifted artists, or budding gifting artists, are paired with an expert for a few days. And the expert gives them some sort of challenge, and they apprentice with the expert. So Lee Volman, Edward Albee, Wynton Marsalis, Josh Groban, Placido Domingo, the choreographer Bill T. Jones, have all been featured in this show. Alan Alda on acting. Bill T. Jones met two young dancers and told them they had 3 days to choreograph, produce, and publicly perform a new ballet, and somehow they managed to do it. And what I love about Masterclass is it provides a window into expertise. Kids need greater access to expertise. I think reality television is kind of a manifestation of that if we want to learn how to dance a classical player, bake a souffle, or even be a drunken loser, there's some expert you can apprentice with. and in a society that's increasingly devoid of apprenticeship experiences, we're getting them vicariously through the Food Network and Creation TV and things like that. So it's great to see what expertise looks like and how experts became experts. But the other reason why I want to share this with you is that a lot of the motivation behind the incredibly mean-spirited, counterproductive education policies that we're operating under are couched in this notion of we're preparing the kids for the real world. And when you hear politicians say we're preparing kids for the real world, you know one of two things is in their mind. One, the real world is really, really, really terrible. Right? That the reason why we're making you do that unpleasant, irrelevant stuff is because you're going to need to do it some other time in your life. That's what Alfie Kohn calls it, better get used to it. Right? That 5th grade teachers tell their kids how awful middle school is, and middle school teachers tell their kids how awful you are. And then you do the same for university. And then the second thing that's in their mind is they don't have a clue what the real world is like. And so, if we want to know what it means to be an architect, why don't we actually ask and watch the best architect in the world, what it means to be an architect. So in this case, I've heavily edited this video down to a few minutes. Frank Gehry meets with these postgraduate architecture students. They all have undergraduate degrees in some form of fine arts, and they want to be architects. And they walk into his conference room, and he has a piece of brown construction paper on one end of the table and a piece of blue construction paper on the other, and he tells them that their job is to design a city. It needs to be between the mountains and the ocean. And the first day, they're going to plan the city, come up with the shared values for that plan. The second day, they're going to build a model of the city. And then the third day, which I don't show, they'll sit down with Mr. Gehry, and each one of them will design a specific building. So they're going to go from macro to micro. Before he leaves them to work on this project, one of the students asks him a question that I am absolutely convinced was serendipitous. He looked surprised when he got asked the question, and the answer he gave changes at various points throughout the episode. So that leads me to believe he didn't really care about it very much. But the question was, what's the population of the city? And Gehry responded initially 1.5 million and growing rapidly. Okay? So let's take a look, and I want to have some discussion afterwards. Oops, hang on. If you were to Google MIT third-year engineering challenge, it looks an awful lot like that. And in fact, if kids have engineering experiences at a young age, it produces a context in which they'll learn the math and science that we think is important for them. When you have to build a prompt, I suggest that there's 3 elements to think about. One is brevity. Like I said a minute ago, it fits on a Post-it note. You can write it on a t-shirt. The second is ambiguity. You may have noticed when I said you have to start on the starting line and land on the finish line, I didn't say that it had to be 40 grams or less and have 4 motors and 3 this or 2 of that. I didn't have a prescriptive rubric by which the best we could hope for was kids meeting our unimaginative standard as opposed to going well beyond it. Because in fact, if the kids had figured out how to launch this into space and circumnavigate the globe and land on the finish line, they would have achieved the goal and they would have learned a lot more than the curriculum required of them. And the third idea in building a prompt is immunity to assessment. What do I mean by that? The kids are pleased enough with the work, they don't care what you think about it. What's an 87 in a poem, or an A- in a piece of music, or a B+ in a robot? The only grades you really should be concerned with are A and incomplete. By the way, the incomplete was my favorite grade to give at university. It's like, it just hangs over them like death forever. There were students who had incompletes for so long I couldn't even remember them when they contacted me to finish them off. And that gets parents' attention as well. Sometimes, like I mentioned a while ago, you want to look at it from different angles. You can do the same kind of project with different groups of kids by just tweaking the prompt a little bit. Let me just wrap up with, I'll go there. So, the best advice I can share with any of you and with any audience I can speak to is less us, more them. Anytime you think you should intervene on behalf of some educational transaction, you should ask yourself, is there less that I can do and more than they can do? I was in a 3rd grade class the other day, just visiting, and the teacher said, hey, do you have any ideas for me to do with my advanced math kids for the next 4 days? And they were walking in the door, and I said, what are you doing next? And she said, fractions. And I said, okay. And I went and got a box of Cuisinart rods. I don't know if any of you remember Cuisinart rods, different colored rods. They don't have values on them, but they're different lengths, and you can build relationships. And I gave a pile of them to each kid and asked each kid to make a fraction. We haven't talked about fractions yet. Kids know the word, it's in the culture. What you immediately see is what they know. And when the kids can make a fraction, I then asked them to tell me what that fraction was. And we put one of them under the document camera at the front of the room, and the kids were wrestling with the problem for a while. And I was sitting in the back of the room, literally, in a reclining chair with my hands like this. I do my best teaching from a lawn chair. And about a minute later, the teacher went to the document camera and lined up the 1 elements so that the kids would count by ones to know what the long one was in order to express this fraction like it. And I just paused and I watched for a while. And then I just said to her, wait, time. And she said, I knew you were going to hate me doing that. And I did hate her doing that. And then I just throw a new problem at a kid if they were ahead and some kids were behind. And one of the things I had to point out to her was, she was, well, what if the kids are screwing around? Well, there's 3 groups right now. They're screwing around, they're messing around and thinking, they're thinking. The last 2 groups I'm not particularly concerned about. You can address the 3rd group, but the desire to rush or fix the 2nd group may ultimately do violence to their thinking and to their understanding of what you're trying to get them to achieve. And there's any number of philosophers, theorists, practitioners who can demonstrate that one good problem is better than 100 identical bad problems. And that the kids, now when you say, oh, by the way, that's called numerator, that's called denominator, kids go, okay, cool, and they move on, as opposed to spending years teaching them something that they might not have known otherwise. So, looking at the curriculum, I was showing some folks yesterday, I've got a book that's out of print now called Is Democracy Fair? That's on the mathematics of polling and apportionment, polling and voting. Right? We got caucuses and primaries and winner-take-all states and polls that determine, averages of polls that determine whether you get on a big stage or, why isn't that part of what we're doing with kids in social studies or math or both? I remember my son who loved history, but had U.S. history in 11th grade, went back to school night. This was 2000, September 2000, that's important. And I listened to the teacher recite the gun rules and the ways in which she was going to punish our children. And then I raised my hand and said, you do anything with like current events? And she said, what do you mean? And I sort of died a little inside. I said, I don't know, we got like an election coming up. And she said they do that in 12th grade. This was 2000 when we had the constitutional crisis and the hanging chads and all the other stuff. A thermonuclear blast next to that history classroom would not have deterred her from the textbook. You know, my nephew, Matthew, was in 8th grade. He fell in love with genealogy. He was fascinated by the subject. He conned me into paying for an Ancestry.com account that I still think I pay $40 a month for. And I should mention it's now the 6th year. And it got to the point where there were members of the family that wouldn't take his calls. He was so interested in this. And the first weekend that he had time to work with Ancestry.com, unfettered, unencumbered by homework and such, he started doing some research, and about an hour in, he asked a fairly innocuous question that caused his father to lock himself in the bathroom with the cordless phone to call his wife to find out what do we tell the boy about the ex-wife he just discovered. And when I talked to Matthew the next day, I said, how's it going? He said, I found out some stuff I'm not supposed to know. and I said to Matthew, I said, look, if you remain interested in this, who knows if this is 2 days or, passing fancy, if you remain interested in this, someday I'll take you to places you find out about. And he did an exhaustive amount of research and found out that 3/4 of my relatives come from an area called the province. There will be teachers from coast to coast downloading worksheets that say, Martin Luther King had a dream. And then there'll be an inch at the bottom of the worksheet that says, write down your dream for changing the world. And kids will write politically correct nonsense. And everyone can pat themselves on the back and talk about how fabulously multicultural they are. And that's not a realistic prompt. One of the things I learned from the great early childhood educators of Reggio Emilia, Italy is, if you ask 3-year-olds, can you build a park for the birds who come to visit the school, they immediately know what that is. And over time, if a kid says, hey, why don't we turn our park into an amusement park? And the teacher asks, well, what's in an amusement park? Well, rides, water features, places to eat, places to rest. The kids can go right back to working on their park and make it an amusement park and measure and cut and plan and invent and explore and tinker. And the result is something they can love and that makes their corner of the world a better place, and by extension makes the world a better place. A few years ago, Apple was pushing an idea called challenge-based learning. Aside from the fact that they wouldn't recognize that they stood on the shoulders of giants and they were stealing ideas from others uncredited, the larger problem with challenge-based learning was they were suggesting you do things like this. Tell kids the planet is heating up, ask them to make a song in GarageBand to eradicate climate change. Or use iMovie to end famine. And a lot of I've worked in really good private schools where every single day well-meaning kids are fundraising for a disease they can't pronounce in a place they can't find on a map. Right? As opposed to doing meaningful stuff in their community or making their school a better place. I've had people literally ask me in conference settings, what do you think about preschoolers doing community service? So, well, I think they ought to clean up after themselves and be nice to one another. I think that when we're talking about prompts, it ought to be something you can do. So if you're creating prompts for a project in a curricular context, I think there's 4 elements to consider. The first is you need a good prompt, challenge, problem, something to motivate you. You need appropriate materials. You need sufficient time. And you should have a supportive culture that includes access to a range of expertise. That expertise can be children as well, but there needs to be distributed expertise. And if these 4 elements are in place, you can solve problems that are much bigger than yourself. If you're missing any one of these 4 elements, it's quite easy to remedy. You know what you're missing. Here's a little video of some 3rd graders in Korea. I helped launch an international school there a few years ago. And these kids had spent a few days playing with these robotics materials. And I told them there was a piece of masking tape on one end of the table and one on the other. One end was the starting line, one was the finish line. And the goal was to make something that when you pushed go, it would land as close to the finish line as possible. And to make it a little bit more challenging, I only let them test their machine on the course 3 times, so that they had to extrapolate as well. So watch this. What grade level could you do that at? All. You can do it with 5-year-olds, you can do it with architecture students. That's the best project of all. Everyone knows what build a city means, right? And everyone can have success at their developmental level, based on their experience, etc. I'm surprised no one brought up the issues of population density and city planning. There are a lot of folks who would say, you need to teach all about that before you ask them to build a city. But all of a sudden, that thing becomes real when you have to make it more dense. And again, if I said to 5-year-olds it needs to be 10 times more dense, they would figure that out. They might not be precise to the, to 1,000%, but they would be able to make it more dense. And then you can say, oh, by the way, that's called population density. When you hang that vocabulary word on the experience, they'll remember it much better. Or we have to teach them about city planning before they do this. Or this, once they have that kind of an experience, it's an invitation for you to dig into the details, to deal with the trade-offs, to discuss how you can make it more beautiful and more dense, to look at other examples of where people have solved that problem. But you could very quickly just start with that problem. I'm going to jump really far. I want to show one more thing and then jump really far in what I was going to talk about. I said that if I ever ran into Frank Gehry, I would ask him the question of whether he had made up that number or not. And he had anticipated the question. And last spring, I was at the Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles that he designed, and I ran into him. And I asked him the question, and he said, yeah, he just pulled it out of his ass. And if the student hadn't asked, he would have never put that parameter on. Which is kind of cool, because I bet you the next time he does it, he'll use that. And if you're teaching 5 periods a day, tell the first class it's 100,000, tell the second class it's 200,000, tell the third class it's underwater, tell the fourth class it's on the moon. That all the same skills and concepts will be learned, but they'll do it in a slightly different way, which means when the kids pass each other in the hall or talk at lunch or call each other over the weekend, they'll be sharing the experience. A friend of mine coined the term collaborations through the air, which is this phenomenon that happens in schools where kids learn something in period 1 on the east end of the campus, and period 2 is happening on the west end of the campus. And you have no idea how that happened. But if you sort of just tweak the project a little bit for different classes, it makes it more interesting for you, and it gives the students more to talk about informally. This is an approach that places like Bard College take with their freshman colloquium, where everyone reads the same 10 or 12 books, but you might read them with a physics professor, and you with a photography professor, and you with a humanities professor, and then when you come together, you're talking about the book, but you have through a slightly different lens than your classmates. It enriches the experience for everybody. Let's see, all that. Let's talk. Let's see. Yeah, let's start. So, when we have wonderful technologies that allow us to solve problems, to make things, to express ourselves in ways we never imagined before. It adds to our toolbox. It enriches the experience. It creates a broader, deeper range of projects that have never been possible before. That there are project ideas everywhere. And with the advent of 3D printing and laser cutting and microcontrollers and computer programming, we can start to make real things. We don't have to be bogged down by simulation and modeling. And in fact, when these same tools and processes and techniques are required and found in the physics lab, the art studio, and the auto shop, we can stop sorting kids into winners and losers. Because you're as likely to find a 3D printer in the physics lab at the art studio as in the shop where you're making the part that makes the carburetor. And we've overvalued learning with one's head. The future's going to require us to learn with our head, heart, and hands equally. Because even if you're academically successful in a traditional sense, you're going to need to be able to solve your own problems. The best thing we can do as educators is to prepare kids to solve the problems that none of us have even anticipated. I told the parents this last night, but I'm the parent of 3 university-educated children, and the only one who has lived on her own independently with a job and an apartment since the day she graduated was the art major. I have 2 friends who are television show carpenters. I don't mean they make stuff for TV, I mean they make stuff on TV. And I am confident their guidance counselor didn't tell them they could earn 7 figures a year making tree houses on television. I actually know more television show carpenters than I know doctors or lawyers or hedge fund managers. The world's a different place, and we can't fully anticipate what kids are going to need to know and do. We need to give them the sorts of habits of mind and perspective and ability to continue to learn in ways that will serve them into the future, into an uncertain future. So I mentioned that project ideas are everywhere. I was working at a school in rural Arkansas, and this was in the hallway. It's not a piece of kitsch or nostalgia, it's functional. That you put $1 in and you get a pencil, and there's a member of staff who fills the pencil machine and takes the money out. I was kind of horrified by this, and they were getting involved in the maker movement, or learning by making, learning by doing, and they were looking for project ideas, and I said, I would start the year by making preposterous vending machines and filling the corridors with them. So that gave me an idea for another setting. I was working with teachers a couple weeks later in Fredonia, New York. Yup, it's a place. And, hail, hail Fredonia, land of the brave and free. And I suggested to these teachers that they use a bunch of craft materials and robotic stuff I had and build a vending machine. That was the prompt, just like make a city. Everyone knows what a vending machine is. And when you have some success, you're emboldened to test the hypothesis, improve it, make it more complex. Add a coin box. Make sure the coin that triggers it is a dime as opposed to a nickel, and etc. You can add complexity to it. One group of teachers remains particularly memorable. They had a stuffed giraffe, and they wanted to make their stuffed giraffe vomit gumballs. That was the vending machine. Well, after a little bit of time and experimentation, they realized that puking gumballs is hard, but pooping them is easy. And so their gumball their vending machine poop gumballs. That led to really interesting discussions about, I wonder if that's how mammals evolved. That maybe gravity's our friend. And which, you would have never thought that this had a connection to biology, this sort of goofy, quasi-engineering project. But it led to all sorts of interesting discussions. We don't have to engage kids in fake or toy problems, even if what they're playing with is toys. I'm consumed by the question of what's the smallest seed we can plant that grows the most beautiful garden, that creates the largest blossom. Can you get your entire curriculum onto a Post-it note? This isn't an exercise in writing tiny. It's a way of thinking about what can you ask the kids to do that with minimally invasive instruction, as my friend Sugata Mitra calls it, the kids will be able to have maximum agency and engage in work that's profound and powerful. So, I have this idea that I call a good prompt is worth 1,000 words. This is the only way that let's go over this a little bit. So who has an observation or a question that they'd like to share? Yes, sir.
I think something that you did, and something that you said earlier about the whole preparation for the real world, it doesn't have to be a terrible thing, right? The real world doesn't be miserable. But I think what he's trying to have to demonstrate is that it is full of impossible problems to solve. So the complexity can be communicated without the, I guess, sort of connotation of real world. So he gave me something possible. It's direct, the brain's trying to figure it out, but there may not be any particular answer.
Well, there's not one answer, certainly.
Right.
And I think what you mentioned points to a kind of unpleasant trend, unfortunate trend, which is somehow making failure virtuous. You hear a lot about how kids have to learn failure. We have to add failure to the curriculum. You know, and this is one of these half-baked ideas that come from the books that school superintendents buy in airport gift shops. It makes no sense. There's no way that the same thing you threaten kids with can be what motivates them. And it's not about failure at all. It's about the best problems push up against the persistence of reality. That you might just have some obstacle you have to overcome, or you realize you need another part, or you need to know how to do something else in order to overcome that challenge. It's not, failure is a judgment that's imposed on you by someone else. And I think that's it's a sort of toxic way of viewing problem solving, to sort of celebrate failure. It's become de rigueur, but I don't think it's a good way of thinking about what goes on when we're learning. And failure has a kind of finality to it, right, too, right? Like, I failed, okay, screw it, I move on. As opposed to, I still care about this, I want to get better at it. What else? Yeah.
I'm fascinated to see how he handled the situation.
I know you don't like this, but not everybody can hear.
Okay. Yeah. I'm fascinated to see how he handles this because there was kind of a really, I don't know, discouraging loss of innocence that occurred when the kids built this monstrosity of a mess and said, well, we didn't quite compromise all our morals, but that confrontation of what they value and what they have to do, it's going to be interesting to see how he resolved that for them, to keep them optimistic, because otherwise they're a bunch of young people who just got slam dunked and squished, you know?
I tend to think they're a little bit more resilient than that. They look kind of bummed out, but it's also worth remembering, and I'm sure if they bothered to Google Frank Gehry, they would find out about how the Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, which has a titanium skin on it, caused the condominiums across the street to heat up by about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Or the building that leaks at MIT, or etc. That this is a kind of an imperfect science and art, and there is a fallibility, and it's about infinite trade-offs as well. So I'm not all that concerned about that. I think they want to. You join a community of practice when you try your best to emulate the behaviors of the experts, and I think that they want to be architects, and they recognize that he's an expert architect, and they're willing to put up with some of that. What else? Yes.
We talked a little bit about, once he gave them that new parameter of a greater population, how they destroyed what they had done before, and then went to rebuilding, and we were just curious about that. versus the mindset of, well, let's modify what we already have. So I just was wanting to know more. Just more
Well,
about
they
that.
had a finite amount of space. They needed to make it denser. I might also point out that he had told them what the population was going to be before they started. They chose to ignore it, right? So then they just had to come to grips with the fact that they had ignored a key point and they needed to start over. I might also point out that he asked the students, how tall is that building? And they said 12 stories. If they had said 120 stories, they would have been finished. Right? Go ahead.
I guess I would be interested to know, I don't need the mic probably.
I know you don't, but people there sometimes.
Oh, yeah. If he knew the task could be done when he gave it to them. Like, obviously there are these parameters of space and there's these parameters of like 1.5 million, and he made up, in real life they exist, but he had all these parameters. But what he didn't say is, and I know it can be done, figure it out. Like, what if at the end it's just kind of like, yeah, you're right, we can't put this city here. Is that okay?
It's a really excellent question. I don't have a definitive answer for you.
Right.
I know that in my own teaching, a lot of times I just have some idea and say, let's have a go.
Right.
And we'll see
Let's just see.
we'll see where this leads us.
Yeah.
What else?
The process of discovering it's not going to work is still a learning experience.
Oh, certainly.
Right. So that if that's reality, this is not a place for 1.5 million people, then that's the learning experience. However, I've been to New York, I've been to Manhattan, where there are, in a 12 by 5 mile island, there's 3 million people that live there, and another couple million people that come there every day to either work or as tourists. So 5 million people on the island at any given time, 12 by 5, and there's a big portion of that's called Central Park, where it's not dense there.
1/6 of New York City is parkland.
Yeah. So to just to expand on, I think that the learning experience is there, and maybe that we learned we can't do something, and that's a good learning experience. Sorry.
Sir?
What do you call, when you talk about Frank Gehry making those structures that didn't work and stuff like that, and they're not failures, what are they then? Like, what do you, if the kids you make a plan and they don't get there, right? And it's the experience, but how do you articulate to the kids that it's not a failure, it's just the experience without saying the word that way?
I think you just did. I mean, I think education is growth. And you want to take kids from where they are moving forward. I often astound my colleagues when they ask me to work with, I told a story last night. One day I came into work last year and they told me that Wilson, who was in the 5th grade, was now my intern. And it was really clear that meant it was either that or we're throwing him out. And Wilson was kind of high-strung and bounced off the walls. And I told him my goal for the end of the year was for him to do 2 consecutive things. We only got the 1 consecutive thing. But I wanted to. I was hoping, wanted to see some growth. The other thing I told people about Wilson was, and the reason why I bring this up was, his teachers were astonished that I never bothered to ask them what was wrong with him, because I didn't really care. I had some intuitions, but it didn't matter to me. And I think even the school sort of official IEP version of him was completely wrong when I found out that he could play the cello and was performing the Brandenburg concertos and such. So this kid who you're told can't sit still and can't focus on anything, kind of can in other contexts. And then so it's a challenge of figuring that out. But I think we have these preposterous benchmarks. There's a bunch of stuff in the Common Core, particularly in the younger grades, that there isn't a single developmental psychologist who's ever seen a kindergartner do what's in it. And yet, we say all kindergartners will. So it's impossible. And when we say all kindergartners, there might be an age range of 18 months. 18 months out of 5 years, it's a pretty sizable, it's a large percent of error that you're dealing with there. I was in a meeting in New Jersey where they were crapping on endlessly about achieving the standards, and there was a woman from the State Department of Education. And when it was my turn to speak, I asked her if she could explain Cavalier's principle to all of us. And she said, I have no idea what that is. I said, well, it's in the Common Core Math Standards. And she said, well, I'm in charge of educational technology. I said, well, you're ineligible for a diploma in New Jersey, aren't you? Then we have this kind of random nonsense that we expect kids to do, that we think we're supposed to teach, and we're supposed to get everyone to some point by a particular time. It'd be a lot healthier if we had an approach that suggested that we're trying to move the ball down the field rather than to tick off all the boxes. Not that you can't tick off boxes while having experiences like this, which in fact I hope some of the discussion leads to thinking about the teaching aspects of what you just saw. Who else has something? Yes.
I can truly appreciate Frank's approach to instruction. It's a minimalist approach where his experience and knowledge and just mental power facilitates it, doesn't interfere with the mental power and experience of the students, and that's something I appreciate. I wish I could do that. I can't. It's extremely difficult.
What do you teach?
I teach ESL. I'm working on it. I get there sometimes, but that's a new advance.
Well, the hard thing about that is ESL is not a thing, right? It's not like a domain or a discipline or a, right? It's not like you get together with your friends over the weekend and say, let's do ESL. Right? I mean, in fairness, I mean, you're in a tricky position because, let's go see some good ESL this weekend. It's like that's not that kind of thing. It's this school construction. It's a form of intervention as opposed to a body of knowledge. I mean, another thought to think about was I spent a lot of time in the company of jazz musicians. I wanted to be a jazz musician until my conspicuous lack of talent caught up with me. And in fact, Sunday I'll be going on a cruise for a week with about 80 of the world's finest jazz musicians. And it was part of a project a few years ago that won a Grammy Award. And one of the things I really love about hanging out with jazz musicians is how much they care about what they do and how much they care about what they do continually. And I was at the Thelonious Monk International competition this year, and this year was singers. Every year it's a different instrument. And they had a dozen of the world's finest young singers competing for, fame and treasure. And there's a big gala concert with celebrities and hoopla that the three finalists perform at. But the day before, you're in an auditorium like this, where 12 young people have 20 minutes each to perform. And my friend Jimmy Heath, who's a jazz legend at 89 years old, is there every single year. And he sits through every single performance. And I was really touched when one of the young musicians came up to him and thanked him for being here.
Attaboy!